All right, good evening. Welcome to the program. You're listening to the Soapbox here on 90.9, 104.1 WMPG, Southern Maine's community radio station from the University of Southern Maine. My name is Eric Poulin. Thank you for joining me this evening. And tonight I'm thrilled to have two guests here in studio, very well-informed and eloquent and articulate in all things local and national politics. We have Zack Anchors, who's a local journalist for the Portland Phoenix and also the chair of the Voter Education Brigade. Welcome, Zack.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
And also Mike Tipping, who works with Maine People's Alliance and is the author of the Tipping Point blog with Bangor Daily News, as well as a weekly column with the Portland Press Herald. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
So as you might have guessed, we are going to sort of join this conversation that everyone is having today, breaking down the election results from yesterday, both locally and nationally. And we would really like to invite you, the listeners, to call in and join the conversation and tell us what your reaction is and how you're feeling and what you were hoping for and what you think the takeaway should be from this election. The phone number is 780-4909, and you can join the conversation with Mike, Zack, and I. So, first of all, let's start. I mean, all of the talk today seems to be about this notion that there has been a Republican wave election here, right? But if you dig down even just a little bit into the results, it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? Nationally as well as statewide. So there has been this seeming endorsement of right-leaning Republican candidates across the nation, but some of the ballot initiatives across the nation, which lean more progressive, passed, even in some more conservative states. So I guess, Mike, let's start with you. What do you think the lesson should be for the Democratic Party coming out of this election?
Wow, that's a big question. Yeah. So 5 words or less. Huh?
Now take your time. We got a half an hour.
So I think there's a lot of lessons to come out of this one. I think, very few people predicted this big of a wave. I mean, it was expected to be a Republican year across the country and in Maine, but the polls even didn't predict this across the country. They were off by about, 5 points overall. One thing that we did notice from some of the results, and this didn't hold true all over, but there were some, bright spots of progressive candidates that really, stood up for their values and did well. We're talking, actually, we don't know the result even tonight of one particular state Senate race where Jonathan Fulford, a Democratic candidate, very progressive. I mean, you go on his website, his first bullet is raise taxes on the wealthy, is right now locked in a dead heat with the Senate Republican leader, and has a chance of winning that, even though Democrats across the state lost their races. So I think there's something there about standing for what you believe in, and voters seeing that and seeing leadership and voting for that. And I think in a kind of perverse way, the reverse was true for Governor LePage. He was definitely seen as a leader by people that perhaps voted against their own interests in some ways.
Zack, how would you explain sort of the shellacking that the Democratic Party took? Was that a failure of vision or leadership or communication or messaging? What was that?
Well, I think one dynamic at play in this election that stands out is that Democrats, in many cases, just didn't actually run as Democrats and as having any kind of real vision. They were often very much in the defensive and just running as the alternative to Republicans. And that happened in Maine and in many other places. And I think that was a major factor at play. But it was also just, I think it is true that there's just a lot of anger at Washington in general, and at the Obama administration in particular, and a lot of these conservative states or kind of swing states. There just wasn't enough momentum for real change to push Democratic or progressive candidates.
We do have a phone call, a caller on the line. Katrina in, was it Portland or South Portland? Portland. Go ahead, Katrina. You're on the line with Mike Tipping and Zack Anchors on the Soapbox.
Hi. I just have a quick question. I know is the Voter Education Brigade the same as the League of Young Voters?
Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, they're pretty much the same. The League just
Yeah.
shut down last year, and the League had been producing this voter guide for many years. And so a group of people just decided to carry on the voter guide. And so we just kept making it and created a new name for the group.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for your call, Katrina. Mike, do you wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to say, I mean, that's kind of the broader picture. In Maine, there was obviously some specific, elements that contributed to things in this election. Obviously, there was a three-way race in the governor's race. May not have ended up being, splitting the vote in terms of strategic voting sense in the end, but it certainly influenced the direction and the content of the election. And Mishu had to deal with, people attacking him on both sides and, often on some of the same things throughout the election. And I'm sure that was something that LePage appreciated and really kept Mishu's numbers down. And obviously there was the referendum on bear baiting that may have brought some conservatives in rural areas to the polls. And then just generally it was a midterm election, which means that Democratic-leaning demographic groups, including young people, unmarried women, people that minorities, people that traditionally vote Democratic, often sit out, unfortunately, and that makes a big difference.
Mike, maybe you can help me understand, where has the Democratic Party been on ranked choice voting in Maine? You would think we could have seen this problem coming after 2010, when Libby Mitchell and Elliot Cutler split the vote. It seems pretty clear that we don't really have an accurately representative democratic process in Maine or the nation. And the Voter Education Brigade and formerly the League has sort of been behind the push for ranked choice voting here in Portland. We've seen it work on a local level. Why are there not more Democrats leading this charge?
Well, that's a question for them to answer, but I will say that, as working with the Maine People's Alliance, that is something that we support and we've been championing as well. And it's something that we even, we did the first, one of the first in the country ranked choice polls during the mayoral election with the Maine People's Resource Center, and actually looked at people's choices and how they ranked out, and we're pretty close on the results for that. And so obviously it's something that, provides a greater ability for people to make, choices that a plurality and actually in the end, usually a majority of voters approve of. And it helps both with the content of the elections and the quality of the candidates.
Zach, did you have anything you want to add to that? I mean, what is your sense among the members of the Voter Education Brigade in terms of their support for ranked choice voting and your feel of, what the perception is out there?
Well, there's been very strong support among our members, and the League's been pushing, like you said, ranked choice voting for many years. But I don't think that there has been much of a push from the Democratic Party. And I mean, I think one of the reasons why we've supported ranked choice voting is because it does provide more opportunities for independent candidates and for Green Party candidates, so they can run without being accused of being spoilers. And I think there's not a lot of incentive for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party to really support that. I mean, there is now. I think this has maybe taught the lesson this election, but in the past there hasn't been.
You're listening to the Soapbox on WMPG. We are talking about yesterday's election results. Call us up, 780-4909. Join the conversation. My guests are Mike Tipping and Zack Anchors. My name is Eric Poulin, your host. Mike, I wonder how much of a problem has it been for, say, the Democratic Party in particular, more so than the Republican Party, this reluctance that they seem to have to really push for legislation that might irritate some of their big donors, which is really another way of saying how much of a problem is money in politics right now?
Well, I'm not sure about the irritating big donors thing. We should probably get into specifics if we're going to make statements like that. But I would say that money in politics is a huge and ongoing issue. I think, obviously, we saw a lot of spending in this election. We've seen it for the last two statewide elections, and a big part of that has been the getting rid of matching funds as part of the clean election system here. It used to be if someone came in and spent a lot of money on the outside, then the candidates that were running clean would get some money to respond and, have more of an equal voice. But that was struck down because of a Supreme Court decision. There is an effort underway right now, and there were folks gathering signatures at pretty much every poll across the state to reinvigorate our clean election system and put a new system in place that'll work better for that.
Yeah, I was gathering signatures for part of Election Day yesterday for the Clean Elections Initiative, and it was just really amazing how many people supported that. I mean, we just asked people, would you support getting money out of politics to strengthen the clean election system, and virtually everybody was willing to put their name on that and sign the petition to get it on the ballot next year.
See, what I don't understand is that seems to be self-evident, that there are a lot of people out there that get these sort of basic issues. Ranked choice voting is a fair approach to elections. Getting money out of politics is perfectly sensible to the average person. These are progressive issues. Why are there not progressive candidates picking up and running hard on these issues? Or are there, Mike? I see you furrow your brow there.
Well, I mean, there have, obviously, in the last couple of weeks, there were two politicians in the Portland area that made a big stand about that, Diane Russell and Dick Woodbury. I think perhaps ranked choice voting is a little more complicated than some of these other, basic progressive issues. It's a little harder to talk about because you have to get into some of the mechanism of it instead of just talking about basic fundamental values, which I think we should be talking more about. And I think we may, hear a different story here in Portland when we talk about those kind of things than we might across the rest of the state. But I will say I wish, I do hope that this ranked choice effort works, but I'm a little worried about how quickly it was thrown together. I mean, they were trying to get volunteers for the polls this election when people were already volunteering for candidates, when people were already volunteering for the clean elections process. They don't seem to have lined up the kind of support behind it that you need to win a statewide referendum. So I'd be a little bit worried that even if they get the signatures and go forward with it, it may actually lose and then put us back in terms of getting that kind of electoral reform that we need.
Well, so let's talk about some of the more sort of fundamental values. What is your sense, if there is one, Mike, to be gleaned from this election, that, what values were the voters sanctioning, both locally and nationally, if they were at all?
Well, I think it, varied race to race and candidate to candidate. One of the interesting things that I saw was a couple of races in Lewiston and Auburn where good friends of mine were running, and they did very well. They won, newly going to be headed to the legislature. And actually, a lot of the people that voted for them, these good progressive candidates, actually voted for LePage as well, which I may never fully understand, but I think there's something there about...
I was really hoping you'd be able to explain that.
People, standing up for what they believe in. One of those candidates that I'm really proud of is Gina Milorano, and she actually is one of the 70,000 Mainers that was denied health care because of LePage's 5 vetoes of those bipartisan bills to accept federal funds. Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty excited that she's going to be now headed to the legislature, have a vote, be able to stand toe-to-toe with him and with the Republicans that denied her health care, and be able to stand up for those folks.
Zach, I think we were talking about this before. A lot of people were surprised by the margin of victory for LePage. They thought it would be a lot closer. He's built on his success from 2010, which surprised a lot of people. What is your sense of what is connecting with the voters in Maine? What of LePage is connecting with the voters in Maine? What did they like about him?
Yeah, I mean, I think Democrats and progressives really have to reckon with the fact that about half of Mainers share values with, share the values of LePage and basically like him. And I think that a lot of people have been assuming for the last several years that his election in 2010 was just a mistake and it was just some freak thing. And, once they saw him, they would realize how once they heard all his foolish gaffes and everything, they would just never reelect him. But we live in a state where half the people support a guy like that and those values. And I think, one of his major goals that really resonates with voters is welfare reform. I think that a lot of Mainers really believe, and a lot of Americans believe, that there's a lot of poor people who are milking the system. There's this delusion that the welfare system is rigged and there's widespread corruption, and it's just not true. And I think that Democrats and progressives should confront that more directly.
So this goes to that question of values, Mike, that you were talking about, right? So explain to listeners. I think we probably have a somewhat sympathetic audience, but explain so that they can make the argument. Why is that not a problem? Why is the welfare state in this state and also in the country not a major problem?
Well, you got to get to what's behind that, because it's not about welfare or welfare fraud, because that really doesn't exist except in anecdotes. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a very small problem. Even LePage, claiming with this, immigration thing, which is basically an attack on immigrants, the amounts he's talking about are tiny. They're less than he wanted to spend on that plagiarized report about welfare fraud. So what it really is about is people are looking for someone to blame for some of their problems, and that's a very visible group that you can point to. And I think what we need to do is redirect that energy towards the people and the groups that have actually rigged the system against people, both the political system and the economic system, and really point people towards those changes that'll make a difference in a big way.
Something I haven't heard a lot of people talk about yet today is that for some time now, the Republican Party has been waging a war on the access to the ballot box. And they've been making it more difficult through voter ID laws, voter registration laws, claiming this war on this problem of voter fraud, which doesn't actually exist, but making it harder for working class, poor people, immigrants to be able to make it to the ballot box. How much of a problem do you think that is going forward, Zach? Is there a way that progressives can push back against this, or is this just the new norm?
Yeah, well, in Maine, it hasn't been as successful as in other places. I think in Maine, there's not as much. We don't have voter ID law. We don't have. It's still pretty accessible for people to vote, but on a national level, I think there's no easy answer. But I think we need to. The argument that can be made that's really most convincing to me is to show the historical roots of this and how it wasn't that long ago that that we passed the Voting Rights Act because a huge portion of the American population was systematically being denied the vote and disenfranchised purely based on race, and things have not really changed that much over several decades. And it's the same techniques at play. It's just not as explicitly about race anymore.
Not as overtly about race. But of course, the vote has always been limited in this country, right? From the founding of the country, Mike. Is this problem worse now than it was before, or is this just the new version of that problem of the limitation of the vote?
Well, I think it's certainly become more of a partisan tool in the past few years, and you've even heard some Republicans come out and say, we'll win if we're able to limit the franchise here. But I think the reason, and this is a good thing you picked up on, Zach, that it's different here in Maine, is that we fought that referendum on same-day voter registration. They tried to put the same things into place they've tried everywhere else. And, we stood up, MPA, we led the charge to gather those signatures. They said we couldn't do it, but we did it in a month. And got it on the ballot, and won with 60% of the vote. And I think that really put, a stake in the heart of those efforts here in Maine, and people actually cared about their vote.
You are listening to the Soapbox on WMPG with Mike Tipping and Zack Anchors here in the studio. My name is Eric Poulin, and join the conversation by calling 780-4909. So let's go back to some specific races. The big ones, Susan Collins over Shenna Bellows, no big surprise there. Shenna Bellows did manage to get about 30% of the vote. Was this, would you consider this a victory for her? No one ever expected her to win, or was that disappointing? Let's start with you, Zach.
I think it's she could have done worse for sure. I think she did well. She ran a very spirited campaign. And she put a lot of really important issues on the table and really challenged Susan Collins, especially on economic issues. I thought really pushing her on her lack of support for equal pay and for raising the minimum wage. And
did those land though?
No, not really. I mean, Susan Collins is pretty good at just brushing that off. But still, I mean, she did the best she could.
What's your sense, Mike, on that race? Shenna definitely put up a good fight, but for some reason, Susan Collins continues to be seen as a moderate in this state. And
Yeah, Susan Collins is an institution. I think a lot of people think she's Olympia Snow. But I really like Shenna. Actually worked with her on the same-day voter registration. She's a wonderful person, has good values, and I think she ran a very strong campaign and really challenged Collins in a way that she hasn't been. I think the media often, doesn't get into those kind of things and doesn't want to challenge a sitting senator with that kind of popularity on some of these votes. But we did have some of those conversations during this election, which is very good for our democracy.
And let me ask, what is up with Angus King? There was the endorsement flip-flop, and now there was this brief question of whether or not he was going to continue to caucus with the Democrats. I mean, does this guy just not have an ideological center, or what's going on with him?
I think he thinks of himself as very pragmatic, and he's going to stay uncommitted to any party. And that's one of his ways of, like Susan Collins, really presenting himself as moderate and as sort of neutral and nonpartisan as much as possible. And I think voters in Maine really like that. They really like politicians who portray themselves as moderates, even when they're actually supporting policies that are pretty radical in some ways.
Well, and it boggles my mind because there are such dramatic differences between, and I'm not really a huge fan of either of the parties, but there are such dramatic differences between the two parties. I mean, how can you not be sure with whom you're going to caucus? So certainly issue by issue, yeah, take it on that level. But we have a caller on the line, John from Millinocket. John, go ahead. You're on the air on the Soapbox.
Hey, I have a problem with Democrats in this northeast corridor part of the country for this reason. The Second Amendment, the Northeast has the most strictest gun laws in the nation. And if you vote one of them in office, they pretty much, whether they say they agree with the Second Amendment or not, they go off and pass laws that make it harder for legal citizens to own firearms. They say things like, for instance, more background checks. Well, you know what? You go buy a firearm in this country, you got to wait for 45 minutes at Walmart, wherever you go. It ain't like criminals are able to go out and buy them. But the whole Northeast has the worst gun laws in America. And if you vote a Democrat and in Maine, you pretty much going to lose more of your Second Amendment rights because every single last one of them in the Northeast already. You look at Massachusetts, you got to have a law. They have a law that says you have to have a license to have a firearm. Yeah, I'm sure that's what our founding fathers meant for the Second Amendment. And you look at Connecticut the same way. You look at New York City, you're not even allowed to have a gun in New York City, period.
John, let me ask you, are you a hunter, or are you speaking of owning them for...
I'm a hunter. I'm
okay.
a hunter.
Yeah.
And I'm a member of the NRA.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? If the Democrats want my vote, they got to change their stance on the Second Amendment because their stance on the Second Amendment stinks.
Okay, well, thank you for your call, John. I appreciate it.
Okay.
So Maine does have a pretty strong hunting tradition, and I think as far as if we are considered a liberal state, I think we're probably a little bit more lenient in terms of gun laws than maybe some of the other Northeast states that John was referring. What is your sense of the electorate in Maine? Zach, do you have any sense of where they fall, the majority of Mainers, on gun laws?
Yeah, and I think that was very much at play in this election with the ban on bear baiting on the ballot. I think that a lot of people who support gun rights and who are hunters and who just want to hunt bears as many ways as possible came out, and that was certainly one factor in LePage's reelection.
Mike, do you have any sense of, is there sort of a middle ground here for people who are concerned about, say, gun violence or guns falling into the hands of the wrong people versus the people who have a strong cultural tradition of hunting and firearms, and these mean something to people?
Yeah, I think there was common ground there. I think perhaps there's less and less, and part of that is, again, partisan politics. background checks, which he mentioned, are actually widely supported in Maine, but there's a difference between something that has, majority support and the intensity of that support. And so people that oppose gun safety legislation, restrictions on buying firearms, they're a lot more passionate about it, more willing to stake their vote on it, more willing to donate to those causes, more willing to get out to the ballot booth than people that perhaps represent a majority, feeling the other way.
Okay, something we haven't we're running out of time, but if you do want to call in and join the conversation, you have just a few more minutes, 780-4909. Something we haven't talked about yet is President Obama. A lot of people are saying that this election was a referendum on President Obama, and Maine got swept up in this, in this referendum on President Obama. I think a lot of progressives were disappointed and remain disappointed with President Obama. And I've made the argument that, he was elected in 2008 with a strong, once-in-a-generation mandate to enact sweeping, fundamental, systemic change. And when he failed to do so, I think he was elected on sort of this populist wave, right? This reactionary wave to the excesses of the George W. Bush era. And when he failed to act on that, failed to curtail Wall Street, failed to curtail the spending on military and climate change, and he's done some things on climate change, sure, but that he drove that populist wave right into the arms of the Tea Party, which started playing up this middle class economic argument. So what can progressives do? And what is your sense, Zach? What was this a referendum on President Obama? And if it was, what exactly does it say about the voters? Does it say that they are ultra conservative, or does it say that they're just disgusted with the Democratic Party, which doesn't seem to be doing much for them?
Well, I think it's both. I think in many parts of the country it was very much a referendum on Obama, and there was just a lot of explicit anger directed at Obama from both candidates, Republicans and Democrats. But here in Maine, I think that was not as much of a factor because Obama is generally popular here among Democrats. I think it was much more of a factor that our Democratic candidate just wasn't very strong and wasn't very inspiring to voters and didn't offer a compelling vision to voters. And LePage wasn't as didn't discuss people as much as many Democrats thought that he would.
I think if you look at the comparison between LePage and Michoud, I think Michoud had this stench of Washington that he never really worked very hard to distance himself from. And LePage speaks to the people. He has that populist appeal, right? That people see him as, he doesn't sound like a politician. He sounds like you or me. And I think on a very superficial level, that is appealing. What is your sense of that, Mike?
I think it's hard to argue that Mike Michoud sounds like anything except for a working class guy. So I think he has a bit of that too. But I think there's. We
got about 30
here?
seconds. Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead though.
So I think there's definitely an issue there, and I think the bigger one was that LePage was allowed to control the election in a lot of ways. So he picked some of the issues that he kept going on about, and they became the issues of the election. And he actually attacked Michoud on some of his strongest points. I mean, he kept calling him dishonest. And this is a guy that, is incredibly honest and incredibly straightforward, especially for a politician. But LePage did this giant thing where he said, I'm not going to go to the debates, and that got a week worth of coverage. And, he played it like a fox, and did the Karl Rove thing of going after someone's strengths. And it was difficult, I think, for Michoud to come back from those kind of things, partly because it isn't in his nature to be as, cutthroat a politician as LePage. And also, it was a three-way race, and, it was harder to own a message when you had people going at different directions.
All right, Mike Tipping of The Tipping Point with Bangor Daily News and with Maine People's Alliance, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. And Zack Anchors writes for the Portland Phoenix and also chair of the Voter Education Brigade. Thank you guys both for being here.
Thanks, Eric.
And thank you for listening. Stick around here on WMPG. Actually, I don't know what show is coming up next, but stick around nonetheless. It promises to be good.
This is the last night on Earth.
Last Night on Earth. Okay, coming up next on WMPG. My apologies for going over, but you can find more information on facebook.com/the Soapbox Portland. I'll post a link to this show as well as all of our previous episodes, as always. Have a wonderful evening, folks. Oh, and thank you to Michael.
No man was 900 years. That's why